All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this Wisconsin Lakes webinar in partnership with Wisconsin Saltwise. I'm Mike Engleson. I'm the Executive Director of Wisconsin Lakes. See a lot of names on here of people that I know, so welcome to all of you. For those who don't know about us that might have found this event, we are the statewide organization of lake organizations in the state and a conservation organization. Obviously work for clean water and have identified issues surrounding salt as one of the drivers of water quality issues, and invited Allison to come talk to our community a little bit about that. Uh, as you know, this is being recorded. If you could stay on mute, and if you've just joined, we're going to try to hold questions until the end. There should be plenty of time to ask questions. When that comes, you'll be able to either raise your hand using there's a function down at the bottom on most screens at least that says raise hand. You should be able to do it that way, or you can type questions into the chat and I will ask them of Allison when we get there. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Allison Madison from Wisconsin Saltwise, who's going to walk us through her presentation. Welcome, Allison.
All right, thanks, Mike. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks everybody for joining in on this very chilly Tuesday afternoon. So, as Mike said, my name is Allison Madison, and I'm going to talk to you today about the Wisconsin Saltwise Coalition, the work going on around the state. But I'm going to start by talking about the problems around salt pollution. So we'll start with the problems, move to a lot of the solutions, and hopefully by the end you feel both kind of like inspired to take some action and empowered to do that. So with that, I'm going to share my screen and switch over to slide view. All right, so Wisconsin Saltwise started in the Madison area with the city, the county, the water utility, the wastewater treatment plant, all saying we've got a problem, right? We're looking at sodium and chloride salt levels just rising year after year in our lakes, in our streams, and also in our drinking water. So there was some local work happening in the 20-teens, and then in 2020 I was hired to try to figure out how to grow this work and take it statewide. Is really kind of what I saw as the big need. So right now you're looking at the logos of some of our funding partners or our funding partners across the state. The Fund for Lake Michigan has been the primary funding partner, but that grant is ending at the end of this year, unfortunately. So working right now to try to figure out how to kind of keep this work, really important work, going. I am located right now, although I work statewide, I'm located in Madison at the Capital Area Regional Planning Commission. So a little bit about me. Like many of you, I feel really connected to Wisconsin freshwater. I grew up in northern Wisconsin, in Chippewa County, north of Eau Claire, Chippewa Falls, in a little town called Bloomer. And my parents rented a little trailer, a little lot, I guess, and then moved a trailer there. And almost every weekend, it seemed like we'd go up to the cabin on Sand Lake and go out swimming and fishing. You can see me here with my brother canoeing. Sometimes in our neighbor's boat, we go tubing. But I've always loved just being out kind of in by our water. And yeah, I feel really connected to that. And that's what kind of drives my passion for this work. So for a number of years, I've worked as a teacher, as an environmental educator and a classroom teacher, teaching kids about, science and our world and why we should be taking care of it, how we can do that. And I'm still a teacher, but the students in my classrooms look a little different these days because I mostly work with a lot of people wearing bright orange and in random kind of shops and workshops around the state. So I work with county highway departments and municipalities and contractors, school custodians, and facility staff. And I do a lot of teaching about salt. So road salt is the #1 source of salt pollution in Wisconsin. It does a lot of good, right? It helps keep our roads safer, returns them to bare pavement pretty quickly, depending on temperature. Talk about that. But most people don't really connect that salt, it seems to disappear, right? But it doesn't. All the salt that melts snow and ice moves with that snow melt into our water, and it stays there. Salt, sodium and chloride do not break down. There are other sources of salt going into our water. So naturally, we've got very, very fresh water in Wisconsin, and we are bringing tons of salt into Wisconsin, unfortunately, every year into our water. So water softener salt does contribute to this, as do chloride-based fertilizers, specifically potassium chloride. So I really think we should have signs up. I don't know if you saw that little animation where every place we sell salt that lets people know this salt goes into our water. And I actually can take a question if we want to later about the EPA's safer choice for salting, because I pushed back on that label, and we've had some changes made to that. So it's pretty exciting. But bigger picture here, while we think, a lot of us, that, we've always been salting, we haven't always been salting our roads, and not at the rates that we are today. So I'm going to talk about salt, sodium chloride. It's the same salt we put on our French fries. Although that is a little bit cleaner. I don't recommend using road salt on your food, but chemically it's the same, just a little less pure. So when we're thinking, at home, working with salt, usually, teaspoons, maybe tablespoons. When we're putting salt down on roads, the unit is tons. So this graph on the right, we're talking about millions of tons of salt going down in our country. And in Wisconsin, that works out to be roughly 1 to 2 million tons of salt a year, which again is all making its way into our water. So we say salt for safety, but what we are seeing, and a lot of times, is that we've moved beyond that, right? And when I do these presentations in person, I like to give people some time to think about, why not just salt to the max, and share those ideas. So instead, at home, kind of think about, when you look at that picture, what is off about it? What concerns do you have? Why do we not want to be salting like this? There are several. So one is the cost of salt. Like I said, I work a lot with county highway departments. So sharing with you here what the DOT pays on average for a ton of salt across the state. And the takeaway here is the cost of salt is going up. And so this is actually really good for me and you and everyone who cares about our water, because it's finally, there's an impetus to think about our use of this material, and a desire to be a little bit more efficient with our use of salt. Another reason to think about being more efficient is to look, when we look big picture, at all the damage that salt does. So salt goes down, it degrades our soils, it damages vegetation, it also prematurely ages infrastructure. It eats up metals and concrete. So for every ton of salt that we put down, which costs, roughly $100 from that previous slide, we're doing $3,000 of damage to our infrastructure. And the source for this is a University of Minnesota study that came out just a couple years ago. And then there's what happens when the salt goes into our water. And you're looking right now at a map of lakes and streams that have been tested at some point in the last several decades for salt, specifically for chloride now, because when salt breaks apart, we can look at the sodium, we can look at the chloride. So chloride levels in Wisconsin naturally would be between 0 and 10. We have fresh water, not salty water. We've got fresh water, amazing fresh water. Unfortunately, it's becoming a little less fresh and potentially a little less amazing every year. So you can see that salt levels, chloride levels, are increasing the most in our more urbanized parts of the state. So those values that should be between, the single digits are now moving into the tens, the hundreds, and even in the winter months into the thousands of milligrams per liter. And the DNR has toxicity levels here that are set at 395 for chronic, meaning if levels in a particular lake or stream stay above that for several days, organisms can die. And 757, if an organism is exposed to levels that high for just a short period of time, then they will die. Unfortunately, those values are not biologically protective because they don't take into account the multiple stressors that organisms experience in any given lake or stream. They're not just dealing with salt levels, salt pollution, they also have to find food, and they have to avoid prey or predators, excuse me, and they need to maybe deal with heat stress and other things. So can talk more about the science of that, and a lot of resources that look at what levels are actually tolerable by organisms in our freshwater. And so the current research shows that when we get above 50 milligrams per liter, we start losing a lot of our more sensitive species. So salt, sodium chloride, and I've said this a few times, I'm a very visual person. I actually used to teach chemistry, so bear with me, I get to nerd out just a minute with you. But I think everybody can recognize on the right, H2O, water, right? That's our snow, that's our ice. Those water molecules stick together. And when we want them to release, when we want that snow or that ice to melt, we have to convince them to let go of one another. So we introduce salt, sodium chloride, and the water molecules like salt even more than they like hanging out with one another. So they will let go, they will melt, and we don't have water and salt anymore. We combine the two, we now have salt water, and that's what we have kind of forever. Salt is considered a forever pollutant. It takes a lot of energy to remove the sodium and the chloride from the water once it's in there. So technically it's possible, right? But it would require reverse osmosis. That's incredibly expensive from an energetic standpoint. So that means incredibly expensive from a financial standpoint. And of course, we can't filter everything out of our lakes and streams, or there wouldn't be anything living in them. So back to our lakes. This graph, kind of big takeaway here is that we're seeing those chloride levels rise over time. So we don't have this longitudinal data for lots of lakes across the state, but we do for the Madison area because, you know, we've got a lot of science happening there. And I think back in the 60s, 70s, actually, city council and folks were saying, you know, we need to pay attention to what's happening in our drinking water wells and our lakes now that we've newly, you know, changed practices and are putting salt down. So Madison-Dane County Public Health is the source of this information. As salt becomes on more people's radars, we're seeing, you know, more research happening. This is data from southeastern Wisconsin. The Southeastern Wisconsin Regional Planning Commission has recently engaged in a chloride impact study, trying to better understand how much salt is going down, where, how much salt is in our lakes, kind of what are the better practices we can be using. So those DNR toxicity levels, remember I said not truly biologically protective, but that's what we have right now, are on this graph. And then you see a number of points. These are just grab samples where someone went out and grabbed a little sample of water, took it back, and they tested it at a lab. And a couple takeaways here. One is that we see that road salt in the winter, that those winter applications are really driving those huge spikes in chloride levels. But another thing to notice is even in the summer months, we don't go back down to zero anymore, right? We've salted our groundwater. And so even in the summer months, we can recharge our lakes and streams with kind of pre-salted water. Again, when I do this in person, I usually give people a moment here to think about, you know, what do you know about salt? How do you use salt? What are things about salt? If you talk to different folks, doctors or kids or someone off the street that they might, you know, say, what comes to mind? I like kind of hearing a little bit about what people already know and connections that they have with salt. And then from there, I'm going to kind of share a little bit more of the science. So, one thing people often talk about is pickling food or using salt to preserve food. So that's a great connection because it helps us better understand kind of the damage that salt does in our freshwater ecosystems. So salt, and I'm only going to talk about the pickle effect. So when you put a cucumber in salt water, what happens, right? A lot of water in that cucumber goes out of the cucumber into that salt brine solution you put it in. So we have a cell with water in it and other things like salts. So water is gonna go in and out. But when we add salt around that cucumber, around that organism or that cell, water flows out of the cell. and that makes the cell shrink. Looks a little less happy. That's what allows us to preserve though, right? So we can have delicious pickles. Maybe some of you like making sauerkraut. I always used to do with my grandpa, or salted, jerkies. And those things are tasty, right? But if we think like a level beneath that, like what it means to preserve food, it means that we're stopping other critters, tiny little microbes or bacteria from eating and that food because we've killed them off, right? We've made the environment toxic to those organisms, which allows us to then eat that food at a later date. So that's what we see in our lakes and streams when we're adding a lot of salt pollution. And I did take a snip here of a video that I actually have available on our YouTube channel if you want to really dive into this. Bill Hintz is the speaker here. He's a researcher and professor at the University of Toledo in Ohio. And Bill / his graduate students do a lot of research into the impacts of salt on various organisms in our freshwater lakes, streams, and wetlands. And then he does really an amazing job talking about it too. So this is a little bit of a nudge to check out this webinar that we had with Bill Hintz. So I'll break this down a little bit for you though. So salt pollution going into our lakes here. Zooplankton are the first to be impacted. Zooplankton, think of them like little cucumbers, right? You put them in the salt water, what happens? The water flows out, they turn into little pickles, little dead pickles. So zooplankton populations start going down around 50 milligrams per liter of salt, which means less food going up the food chain. Not so good if we want to be out fishing like Bill's brother-in-law here. So zooplankton also serve another role. They eat algae. So when we are killing off our zooplankton, salt levels go up, zooplankton levels go down, algal populations are also going up. So what Bill sees with the team is that they have a bucket of stream water, they start adding salt to it, they see it get greener and murkier. So a lot of people, I think, who spend time on lakes and value our freshwater understand that nutrients drive the greening of our lakes, right? That's the food for algae. Phosphorus specifically, right, is the limiting nutrient in our freshwater ecosystems. But we're also taking away the things that eat the algae. So we're kind of driving that greening of our lakes from both directions. Bill's team will also do experiments like this with these little fingerling trout here, putting some in plain little bucket of water, and then others get some road salt in their diet, or in the stream, I should say. They're not literally feeding it to the fish. But just like on our bodies, that's a stressor, right? Creates osmotic stress, and fish are trying to deal with that and maybe spending energy kind of pumping extra salt out of their body, which means less energy to grow. So we see reduced rates of growth, reduced rates of reproduction, and higher susceptibility to parasites. If this gets really bad, which it has in Minnesota, Brownie Lake in the Twin Cities area, there are also some lakes in upstate New York that have gotten very salty. Salt water is more dense than fresh water, so it sinks down to the bottom in our lakes, and it create this dense, salty, cold layer that prevents natural lake turnover from happening. This is bad. This is really bad. Brownie Lake at this point, so you're looking at subsurface, so deep level chloride concentrations compared to surface level chloride concentrations. This is a very salty lake, but at this point it's got two layers, the bottom layer being super, super salty, so salty that it's now preventing that natural lake turnover from happening. So we don't have oxygen and nutrients being cycled throughout the lake anymore in the water column, which means that this is considered a dead lake. This graphic shares a little bit more about that impact that salt can have with causing that dense, kind of colder layer that can go anoxic for longer, even if it doesn't fully prevent lake turnover from happening. It can cause phosphorus, that's the P there, to remobilize. So phosphorus that was kind of held immobilized in the lake sediment can come out again and be available in the lake. So again, driving more of that algal production. So it's kind of looking big picture, ecosystem level. When we start to think about, organisms and that impact that salt has on our bodies, and I talk about salt in our drinking water, I want to get back to what a lot of people talk about. First thing that comes to mind with salt in our diet is blood pressure, right? So think back to those pickles and how salt works to draw water out of the cucumber. So if we eat something salty, trying to think the last salty thing I ate, maybe some potatoes at breakfast this morning. So I eat that salt, it goes into my blood, right? So I made a little salt appear in the blood there, in the blood vessels. So now I've got cells with water in them next to something that's salty. So what's going to happen? The water is going to flow out into that salt solution. My cells have dehydrated a little bit, right? But think about what's happened to that blood vessel. All of a sudden there's more volume, there's more water in there, and that's pushing out, that's creating pressure on my blood vessels. So that's high blood pressure. That's how salt contributes to that. And over time, if we're doing this, it can really stress out our cardiovascular system. And indeed, we are seeing that salt is not just in our lakes and streams, it's also making its way into our drinking water. For most people in Wisconsin, that is groundwater. There are a number of people who live right on Lake Michigan who actually drink the lake, the Great Lake. But you're looking here at chloride levels in the Madison area, city of Madison drinking water wells that draw from upper and lower aquifers. So we're seeing that average go up, and then sometimes we're seeing individual wells that spike way up, like this top whisker here, well 14. So looking at across the state, the DNR did in 2022 publish a report on chloride impacts across the state, and one of them was the impacts to our drinking water. So you're looking at drinking water wells. So these are municipal drinking water wells that have surpassed the preventative action limit. Unfortunately, I presented to about 50 some DNR staff last week and pushed them on this. We have these wells that have surpassed this preventative action limit. What's happening? What actions are happening? And the answer is nothing. So we really need to be advocates for ourselves here in our drinking water. And then I have worked with Kevin Masaryk at the UW Stevens Point Well Water Lab to get some help in graphing also sodium levels, because chloride makes our water taste salty. Sodium is what we need to think about if we're concerned about our heart health. And 20 milligrams per liter is the recommendation that the EPA has for people that are supposed to be on a low sodium diet. So any of those kind of yellow, green, orange to orange and red dots are above the EPA's recommendation for anybody who's supposed to be watching their sodium intake. And unfortunately, it can get worse. As I mentioned, upstate New York earlier, around the Lake Placid area where the Olympics happened in 1980, people loved how much salt went down then. It was like we rolled the red carpet, the winter version of the red carpet out, right, for the Olympians, and everybody coming to see them, and the residents were like, this is great, right? I think a lot of people in Wisconsin have gotten used to our roads being, bare pavement, immediately after a storm event. This is great. We want this, right? This is what people said. And now, several decades later, what they're seeing is that some of them can't drink their drinking water anymore. So this is one family that was featured in the news because while they could buy bottled water for themselves, they were not able to buy bottled water for their dairy herd. And so they had to sell their cows. Again, a little bit more bad news bears. This is research coming out of the University of Maryland. Sujay Kashal and his team has talked about this problem of salting our water as freshwater salinization syndrome, because they're seeing it's not just the salt, but as salt goes in, other things are coming out. And he kind of coined the term chemical cocktails, because we don't quite know what's going to come out in our water as we put salt in. It's kind of like water softening in reverse, right? If you have a water softener at home, you might be using that to pull iron out or to pull out calcium or magnesium. And you're exchanging those ions for sodium, right? And putting sodium in your water instead. But we see this happening in reverse in our soils, in our bedrock, and in our pipes. So this problem contributed to the lead crisis in Flint, Michigan. The fact that they were drawing salted water from the Flint River, more lead came out of pipes. So I'm going to try to explain this visually. Again, I'm a little nerdy with the chemistry stuff, so bear with me if this isn't quite your jam on a Tuesday morning or Tuesday afternoon. But sodium and chloride, that's our salt water moving through the soil, and it hits things like little clay particles that are negatively charged. Negative and positives are opposites, opposites attract. So the clay particle can hold on to sodium, but it can only hold on to so many positively charged things. So some of the other stuff that was there, in this case, potassium, manganese, go into our groundwater. The chloride moves on through more readily because it's negatively charged. So what happened days later, weeks later, is that a lot of manganese, in this case, showed up in the drinking water in the DC area where Sujay lives. So they were trying to understand, where did all this manganese come from? And salt is part of that story. So it only takes 1 teaspoon of salt to pollute 5 gallons of water up to those levels that are our current toxicity standard. And we know those aren't even biologically protective. So really, it's more like 1 teaspoon of salt pollutes 10 to 15 gallons of water, but we'll stick with this for now. I try to flip it though, to be a little bit more helpful and hopeful. In my line of work, I like to remind people every teaspoon that we keep out of our water, we're protecting 5 gallons of water. Sometimes I get asked questions about, bioretention ponds and rain gardens. Unfortunately, those do not remove salt from our water. Chloride just moves through readily. Sodium might get held there for a while, but it also degrades those ecosystems. Wastewater treatment plants also do not remove salt from our drinking water, or from our wastewater, I should say. The wastewater treatment plant in Madison ran the numbers. If they were going to remove salt from water, because they receive about 100,000 pounds of salt a day, it all goes downstream, because it would increase sewage rates 500% if they were going to try to pull that out. And it's so energetically expensive, it would be polluting our air to try to protect our water. So I told you a lot of bad news, but I'm going to shift here and tell you some good news. So there's a lot of education happening around the state. Like I said, work with a lot of folks in yellow. Actually, that's Matt Whittam from the town of Lynn up here. I know we had somebody from Lake Geneva on the call. We're in the Walworth County Highway Department shop there, talking with folks from across Walworth County and others in southeastern Wisconsin. So a lot of classes happening. There are materials on best practices for salt use, and I should say winter maintenance in general. I also work to host a lot of equipment open houses. Sometimes it's fun to, a lot of times it's it's a lot of fun to get people talking about the equipment that they use. It's kind of like guys talking about their toys, and you can see kind of, I think, some of the excitement, the passion there in the face and the hands of Corey Teets. He was a street superintendent with the city of Eau Claire. Unfortunately, he's moved on now, but really inspired a lot of changes to both equipment as well as policies of the city while he was there. And then whenever we have equipment open houses, I like to get people to talk to the media as much as I can, and get the media there to help tell the stories and give kudos to the communities that are taking steps to be more salt wise. You might notice this truck has these giant tanks on the side for a lot of liquid brine that can really help drop total salt use. So in summary, this is kind of the events that I hosted, SaltWise events last year: 11 different agency trainings, 9 open houses, 16 workshops, touching over 1,000 professionals in the industry. So this is a lot of my fall kind of driving and doing works around the state. But year-round, host different webinars, which I mentioned earlier. Bill Hintz, have Sujay Kashal. This is one with Corey Teets from that previous slide. So you see Sujay there. Matt Whittam from the town of Lynn. So both the researchers looking at the problems of salt pollution, as well as folks that are kind of more on the front lines and making those calls and making changes at their agencies. So this is just a quick little snip from one of Matt's webinars, and that kind of old school mentality, just leave it, setting 2, good to go. You'll come back, your truck will be empty. So that's the old school mentality, and we really try to shift people to think about what are the best practices out there. We want to be smart about salt. How do we do that? And it's really holistic perspective on winter maintenance operations. So I'm going to just kind of highlight a few of these in the next few slides. But first, I wanted to kind of show you this works. It does. So this is Walworth County again, and showing you their annual salt use for 5 winters when they were just kind of doing business as usual. And then the last 5 winters, as they really started to dial in their practices. They had new staff come in from a different county, and he had some ideas he wanted to bring over. Again, a lot of utilization of brine, but also really paying attention to operations and having a lot of conversations, post-storm debriefs with operators and dialing in their practices. So number 1 is to do that, to look big picture. What are we doing? What are our policies? Do our policies are actually up to date with what kind of the way operations are working? Are we communicating the level of service? And oftentimes what happens is that creep up and up and up to try to do better. And better tends to just mean put more salt down, get everything to bare pavement. Does that really need to be the goal on all of our streets? And also to make sure people have the science in front of them. It's a really cold day. It's been cold for a few days now. When pavement temperatures drop to 15 degrees Fahrenheit or below 15, salt is not effective. It works so slowly. It takes so much more salt to melt ice that we really want to move away from dry rock salt and look at some alternatives or switch to sand for traction. So we want our policies to support that. So mechanical removal. Before you put any salt down, have you removed as much snow and ice as you can first? So we see blades down here on Dolly Plowton. Yes, this is a named plow here, City Madison. Dual wing plow going down with just a little bit of a dusting on the pavement. So secondly, you want to calibrate your equipment. If you are going to be putting salt down, you want to actually know how much salt is going down per lane mile. Are you adjusting that application rate then according to pavement temperature and how much salt is needed? A lot of agencies years ago did not do this. There are still some that have not calibrated equipment. The counties have to, so we've got a win there. And municipalities over 10,000 are supposed to. But this is a story from the city of Stevens Point. Before they calibrated, on average, they put down 4,500 tons winter, excuse me, I was gonna say a lane mile. So 4,500 tons a winter on average. Then they calibrated their trucks, and then they moved to have ground speed control in their trucks, which means as the truck's driving along, if the truck slows down, the salter or the spreader slows down. So auger, spinner. If the truck stops, it stops salting. So they now use about a third as much salt as they used to each winter. And that's more than $100,000 back in their budget. And Chris Johnson is a street superintendent, street supervisor. He also pulled up the data on snowfall to try to show it's not just that they haven't been getting snow those last several winters. Actually, more snow than they had the previous couple sections. So I mentioned adjusting application rates. This is actually a City of Stevens Point truck where they have, you can see that road temperature data available for operators. If you don't have that in trucks, you can actually get an aftermarket kind of purchase to install infrared temperature sensors. And then pre-wet salt settings. So they can use that road temp data to dial in their salt application rates. Like I said, as temperatures warm, you need less salt to melt snow and ice. And it works faster. So they take advantage of that and really limit their rates at those warmer temps. And then there's liquids, the use of liquids. I think all of us have been seeing liquids a lot more on roads, and that's because it makes sense. It's really saving a lot of dollars on salt, but then of course, if we put less salt down, we're protecting our water, we're protecting our infrastructure. So there are a lot of myths out there and there's a lot of misinformation about brine. Happy to take questions about it. The three main ways that we use it, I'm going to kind of outline here. So pre-treatment, anti-icing is the most visually apparent to people because you actually see those lines before the storm. And there's a lot that goes into the decision making around should we anti-ice, should we not anti-ice. But the concept here is that it's like putting a little bit of oil on a skillet. If you're going to cook food and you forget to oil your skillet, you are stuck afterwards, right? Scraping and scraping after, maybe even putting that, skillet in the sink and trying to soak it or scrubbing some more. So you know that if you put a little bit of oil and then the spatula comes, the food comes up much more easily. So the same thing happens with plow blades going down the road. If we have a decent pavement surface and you can kind of prevent that bond from forming between snow and the pavement, the snow comes up much more readily. Sometimes there are even like very small events, like a little frost event, very, very light snow where no post-treatment is needed at all. But in general, that pre-treatment allows the post-salt rates to go down about 30%. Pre-wetting is really a no-brainer. It's spraying some brine on the salt so when it goes down, the salt sticks in place and you reduce the bounce and scatter that sometimes on our highways means that 30% of the salt that's applied is off and out of the lane after the car goes down the road, or the plow goes down the road. So pre-wetting helps salt stick in place. That reduces salt loss. It keeps the salt in the lane where we need it. Also, it provides more immediate results because we have some of the salt already in solution, already in that brine solution. The melting happens immediately. Direct liquid application means the application of liquid only before, during, and after the event. This does not work for every event, but I'm seeing both county highway departments all the way down to contractors that are utilizing liquids and liquids only for many events, and that in general drops salt use about 50%. So just some pictures showing the kind of different scales of the use of liquid based on the size of the municipality. And then just a little bit more work that I've done with municipalities through APWA, which is the American Public Works Association. Worked with the Wisconsin chapter of APWA to create an Excellence in Snow and Ice Control Award. So we had applicants for the first time. This award just opened up late last fall. People had to be on it. I think it was just open for a month. But we had winners, Matt Whittam from the town of Lynn, down in Walworth County, Wisconsin Rapids, and then Walworth County were the winners in those various categories. So want to get more and more people applying and obviously winning this in future years and have more success stories to share out there. One of the big barriers that we have, so a lot of wins on the public side, one of the barriers on the private side is the fear of liability, right? Salt might cost, a few dollars. Yeah, maybe I'm spending hundreds or even thousands of dollars to do some repairs to my turf or buildings, right? But it takes a lot of years of damage to add up to that $500,000 lawsuit because of a slip and fall. So we really have seen the pendulum swing way too far over on the side of excess salting because of that fear of liability. So New Hampshire has a program that had identified this 10 years ago and put into action a solution by providing some limited liability protection for contractors that get trained in best practices. So they are paying attention to pavement temperature, they're doing their mechanical removal, they're calibrating equipment, they're applying the correct amount of salt per acre based on pavement temperature, and saying, if you've come and you've done your due diligence at a site, you're not negligent at all, like you should not be held liable if there's a slip and fall, because that could happen, any month of the year. And it is still winter in Wisconsin, right? Like, we can't remove any chance that there's risk involved. So this bill we took and introduced a Wisconsin version of. State Senator Andre Jacques actually and his staff worked on this, and we created a Wisconsin version of this New Hampshire program. And I, back in 2023, worked really hard, brought folks together from the industry, public works agencies, talked to a lot of legislators about this, and we actually did get it passed through both the Senate and the Assembly. At the end of the day, though, the governor did veto it. He said that this is an unfunded mandate, so we did not have any dollars to run this program. The DNR was in favor of doing it even without any money, because they know they need to be doing something like this anyway. And then, though, there was concerns about a safe harbor provision that would mean that if contractors were not certified, that could not be used against them in court. It would not just put a target on their back, but that was really misconstrued, and just general immunity. So I think the trial lawyers just kind of made their influence known in the governor's office, and we were not able to overcome that. So I did go back to the governor's staff last summer after the governor vetoed this bill, and I said, we need to do something. Like, this is an issue here. If it's not liability protection, like, what can we do? And I brought to them the Ohio H2 Ohio Chloride Reduction Grant Program, which in 2024 initially gave out 1.7 million, then another 2.7, so $4.5 million for road salt reduction equipment grants. And I can share links and more information about that. But I put a pitch together for the governor's staff and proposed that we create a similar program here in Wisconsin. So we'll actually find out tonight. The governor's budget will be announced, and see if it at least got into this initial budget. Of course, we know just because it's in the governor's budget doesn't mean it's going to stick around, but fingers crossed we get that. Also on the private side, through the work around liability protection, a lot of people on the private side have been paying more attention to Saltwise. I've really worked on the partnership with SIMA, which is the Snow and Ice Management Association. So they're a trade organization, and they hosted for the first time at the Waukesha County Technical College a Midwest Snow and Ice Conference. So most of the attendees were here from Wisconsin, from Wisconsin. We had some folks from Minnesota, even Colorado, Indiana, obviously Illinois that came up. So right now, in the initial planning stages for our second annual Midwest Snow and Ice Conference to be held again at the Waukesha County Technical College. So this is really huge, because it's not just me talking to contractors, it's actually contractors talking to one another about the importance of smart salting. So I'm sure you cannot see this tiny little print on here, but it's Aaron Rodman, who runs Extra Mile Snow Removal Company in West Bend. I do believe that's right. And the title that he said he wishes he could have chose, because they kind of snazzed up the title for him and made it a little shorter. But he said, my initial title was make a ton more money by cutting down how much salt you use. You don't need a brine maker or a brine truck. It's stupid simple, and you're throwing your money away, and I want to help you. Oh, and it's better for the environment. So that was pretty cute. He did a great job. So also, another thing that we do Saltwise, try to get the word out. So thank you for helping me do that today. Hopefully each of you can go and talk to another person or two or 10 about this, but trying to get the word out so that the public understands that salt is indeed a pollutant in our water, something we should be concerned about. It doesn't just disappear. So one of the big kind of pushes has been around Winter Salt Week and trying to get the news to pick up on this issue during that last week of January, which has, I think, been pretty successful. And in 2024, leading up to this Winter Salt Week, just a few weeks ago, I tried to bring in a lot of different partners from other states. So we've been promoting this a week now in states from Maine out to Colorado. So over 900 people registered from over 30 states. I think a week ago we were over 2,500 views. Now we're over 2,900 views. So I'm excited to see the traction there. Other little things, there are a lot of other little projects around the state, but I did mention earlier, City of Madison snowplow naming cards, naming contest and then trading cards. So kind of funny or punny. Check it out. It's actually voting is open right now for names. And then on the back of these little cards, there are little Saltwise facts that are out at public libraries. There's also, there are free monitoring strips that you can get, test strips to monitor local streams near you. So that's something you can get through the Isaac Walton League if you're interested. Would recommend that. So yeah, just kind of to wrap it up, I would say, like I said before, talk to people about this, please. Talk both about the pollution, the problem, as well as the solutions that are out there. Some of these are just basic win-win-wins. Promoting Winter Salt Week, promoting Wisconsin Saltwise, the socials, we're on Facebook and Instagram, so that's really some of the easiest ways to just kind of like and share and repost something. Also happy to help if you want to kick off a neighborhood or a community level campaign. Like I said, the local stream sampling kits are available. And looking at potentially reintroducing that limited liability legislation and potentially working with you as a collective, I guess, with Wisconsin Lakes on that. And then I would say that, as I mentioned earlier, I am hoping to try to keep this program going beyond 2025. Pretty big reduction to funding at this point. So trying to fill in those gaps and work with folks to kind of keep this work happening. I think it's really important. So that's what I've got for you, and happy to take any questions. And actually, I'll flip to this screen for a second. So my email, if you want to follow up afterwards, wisaltwise@gmail.com. You can grab a phone out if you want to grab that QR code and click quickly to any of our links.
Thanks, Allison. That was a great presentation. Learned a lot. Really interesting about especially how the presence of salt in the waters can influence other pollutants and other problems that are created by that. We're always looking, to reduce the amount of phosphorus that's entering our waterways and keep the stuff that's in there suspended in the sediments, reduce the impacts of that. And this obviously sounds like it's not helping. We
Yeah.
we can take questions now if you want to use the raise hand function. If you can, I'll call on you and then you can unmute yourself, or feel free to type things into the chat. Sylvia actually has already done so and asked the question, as a homeowner, what are the best products to use on my sidewalks and driveway?
Yeah, so I would say, again, first, mechanical removal, the shovel more, salt less. So trying to remove as much as you can. And then if you do have something left behind, I actually go back with a broom and sweep my sidewalk. And usually that gets me down to bare pavement. If there's still, some residue or something you're concerned about, personally, what I do is I put sand down for traction that I can sweep back up again afterwards and keep reusing. You can, if you're going to use salt, I would just say, try to use it sparingly. In general, again, it varies with pavement temperature, but a 12-ounce mug should be enough for about 10 sidewalk squares. If you've done a good job of that mechanical removal, there are some non-chloride products out there. So you could look for some of the acetate or formate products. That's what they use on airport runways. If you think about it, we don't want to see our planes rusting out, right? So they don't use salt at all on the runways. So it looks like the next question, what's the makeup of brine? So brine, salt brine, is 23.3% salt and water. So counties, municipalities that are making salt brine contractors will literally just take the rock salt that they put on the roads and mix it with water. You can do this in a 5-gallon bucket. They do this in big tanks, and sometimes they're fancy and they allow them to mix different additives in so that you can have additives in brine. When we have temperatures hitting, below 15, definitely below 10, you're going to want to add something into that salt brine. So namely calcium chloride or magnesium chloride, because they work at colder pavement temperatures. You can also add in sugars at any temperature. They help materials stick in place, and they can also further then drop the total salt application. So sugars do not help, or they do not melt snow and ice, but they do prevent refreeze. So that's an added benefit there.
Is that why beet juice is used sometime, if I
Yeah,
remember
so
that
beet
correctly?
juice would be one of those myths. People do not go spray beet juice down the roads, but the sugars from beets can be used as an additive. So I'd say for a more like sophisticated agency that's mixing and blending brine, they might do like 85% sodium chloride, 10% calcium chloride, 5% sugars. Or you can buy a proprietary additive, like a mix, geomelt or beet heat, and they have those other chlorides and the sugars already mixed together, and you can just add them into your brine. But most agencies, I would say probably 90% of agencies, it's just sodium chloride and water. Yeah, I can go deep. I could keep talking about brine, but I'll pause. I'll pause there. Um,
We have a question from Eric. We're in Vilas County, section of highway that was just resurfaced, and they're spraying the roads to the point they're saturated with brine before it snows. Is that what you're referring to? I'm assuming that that would be yes.
Yeah, so I can't necessarily say that, like vouch for their practices. But the pre-treatment of the road before a storm event, as long as the humidity, the dew point, the pavement temperature, the wind conditions like are all right, is the best practice. Now, does that mean that, I mean, you can over brine before the storm. You can over apply. So we really want to be looking at about 40 gallons per lane mile. And again, kind of all the conditions have to be right. And then that would then allow them to use less salt on the back end.
I've also found that the pre-treating is a great way for me to realize that there's bad weather coming if I haven't been paying attention to the weather forecasts. A number of times I've been caught surprised by seeing trucks out applying stuff and thinking, oh, I should probably look that up, huh?
Yeah.
Um, Eric also asks, are you going to be at the Lakes and Rivers Conference next month? And I don't remember if you all signed up for a booth or not. I don't.
Um, is that the one in the Wausau area?
Yeah, Stevens Point.
Okay. Remind me of the date. I'll have to double check that.
It's the March 26th to the 28th.
26th to the 28th.
Yeah, and if
Okay.
you're not exhibiting, we have lots of great exhibitors coming that you should all come check out if you haven't already registered for it. So a
Okay.
little plug in there for the convention.
There we
Uh,
go. Yeah, I have been there in the past. I've presented there in the past. I'm
that's
not
what I
sure,
thought.
yeah, if I'm gonna be able to make it this year. Um,
We have a question about water softeners draining into septic systems, and if you
yeah,
want to comment on
so
that.
let me read over this. So many water substances drain into septic systems, in private systems. It could make its way into groundwater. Yes. Is there data as to the contribution of water softeners and groundwater salt? Each system may be small, but collectively. So yes, this is a contributor, and no, there is not good data on this. I wonder if I can pull this up quickly. Try to talk and do this. I took and graphed water hardness in the state of Wisconsin and all the wastewater treatment plants across the state. There are like 40 some of them at this point that have variances for salt, which means they are wastewater treatment plants that receive a lot of water softener salt. and then discharge it into a local stream. This sometimes happens on the Wisconsin River and into Lake Michigan, and the DNR kind of looks the other way because the solution to pollution is dilution. Of course it isn't, but it tracks really, really well here. So I'll show you, this is kind of at a larger scale, and then I'll kind of come back to kind of the smaller scale question here. So local groundwater hardness, so dark blue, very hard water, and then all these orange dots are the wastewater treatment plants that the DNR has recognized are allowing a lot of salt out into streams, and it's harmful. But again, there's not much they can do about it because these wastewater treatment plants then are trying to go out and educate homeowners to take a look at their water softeners, and that's a lot of work, and it's not been very successful. So if you have a home-based water softener, I would encourage you to take a look at it. One thing would be to make sure it's been installed in the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years, because older water softeners are really salt hogs, and they will regenerate every few days regardless of how much soft water you've used. So I use the analogy of like going to Quick Trip every 3 days, even if you haven't really driven, just dump your gas tank out on the pavement and fill your gas tank up again. Like, you wouldn't do that, right? It's so wasteful, but that's the way that these old water softeners work. So you want to make sure you have a water softener that's only regenerating when it's regenerating by demand, when you've used up the water softening capacity. What is its capacity? How efficient is it? That's another thing then to take a look at. So I'm going to just drop into the chat here our page on home-based water softeners. I spend much less kind of energy on this because I see that road salt is the #1 driver of this right now, and I can go after much bigger users than, a 40-pound bag of salt here or there in individual homes. But you can take a look at your water softener. There are more efficient models. There are some salt-free options. They don't technically soften water, but they work to deal with the scale. Or if you're dealing with iron, you can get an iron filter, an iron curtain, actually they're called. And there are also blending valves. So if you're dealing with water hardness, you can install a blending valve that will allow a little bit of hardness through. So you can be drinking water more similar to Lake Michigan instead of maybe the really hard water here in Madison. But we don't need to reduce or remove all of the calcium magnesium out of our water. In a lot of European countries, that's actually illegal to do that. But here, we're told to soften down to 0. That's the way that our water softeners are set. So it'd kind of be like buying an air conditioning unit, putting it into your window, and just having it, the default factory setting, be 50 degrees. Like, you wouldn't do that, right? You want some cooling, but you don't need it cooled that cold, right? So yeah, so take a look at that web page.
Let's see. Peter, it says he was late in joining, but wondered if the conservation techniques being communicated are being enforced by county transportation departments. Maybe a loaded question.
No. The DOT does require that county highway departments calibrate their equipment, and they do a little bit of education. I was able to actually facilitate a recent tech talk back in 2023, but I'm really pushing the DOT because I do not feel like they are meeting their requirements to do education and training for their staff, much less the DOT is actually supposed to be doing public education and outreach around salt pollution through their TS4 permit with the DNR. And I do not think they're doing that work. I think I'm doing that work. So part of my hope is that I can get the DOT to potentially pay for the work of Saltwise, because I think I'm doing some of their homework for them. There should be more than one of me. But yeah, I last year was invited to come into 8 different county highway departments and speak to their staff from anywhere from an hour to a full 4-hour webinar, or sorry, 4 full hour like workshop. But I mean, that leaves 64 counties, right? So there's a lot of work there to be done for sure.
That's probably a place where people like us can help out by contacting local officials and county officials and talking about this issue with them and prodding them to make sure that their county departments are learning. Because it seems like it's something that is not only good for the environment, but as one of the slides said, it saves money too. It's something
Mhm.
that reduce the tax burden.
No, it just
Um,
definitely makes sense. And what we see is like when people get into this, like they become so excited about it, right? And they're really proud of the reductions that they're making and excited that they're dropping salt use, they're not changing public safety, they are saving dollars, for budget dollars, taxpayer dollars. So yeah, really it's great all around. I see after you sweep up salt, what do you do with it? That's a great question, Sylvia. I have a bit of salt in my basement that I've swept up different places, and unfortunately, there's some moisture in it, and it's all just a frozen brick right now. There are some municipalities I know, like Bayside in the Milwaukee area, will actually take salt from residents. City of Madison does not want to do that right now, which I get. So yeah, I guess if you use salt at home, you could try to, put it back out again. You might need to chip it up if you swept it up when there was moisture around. Otherwise, use it to make some brine. But yeah. Should water softener go down into septic tank or be put on the ground? I'd probably put into your septic tank, I guess. I don't know that would you worry about it killing any of the critters in there? If you put it on the ground, that sodium is going to damage your soil and your grass. Either way, it's going into our groundwater.
mhm.
Is brine tougher on infrastructure than the rock salt? So in general, like I said, brine is sodium chloride in water, so it's diluted rock salt. If we put salt down, we're doing damage. If we put brine down, we're doing damage. But generally, when we put brine down, we're putting down less total salt, so there's less total, opportunity for corrosion and destruction of infrastructure.
And then the last question in the chat is, has there been any conversations with the Lakes team at DNR to encourage lake monitoring? Uh, I know that we have taught when I have had been on conversations and as part of the partnership, we've talked about that. And obviously we've had you at the Lakes and Rivers Convention, but I don't know if there's been talk of explicitly putting that into the monitoring protocol. Do you know anything on that topic, Allison?
So I did, like I said, I did present last week to a whole room of DNR staff up at Tree Haven at a retreat, and there were a lot of the lakes and streams
Yeah.
biologists there. So I was encouraging people to do more monitoring. But I don't know that there have been, like they're looking at, budget cuts and concerns about, maintaining. So I don't know that adding is really so much on the radar.
Yeah, and I know sometimes when it would seem like adding a different thing to be monitoring for should be simple, but sometimes it's a matter of if the data is collected, is there the right kind of place for the data to go? Are the systems that are being used to collect the data able to handle it? And so sometimes there are more sort of back end administrative headaches that again, because of staffing and time, sometimes they don't aren't have not been able to get to. So that could contribute a little bit to that. I have one more small question about the home use and then kind of a grander question. Um, what about the kinds of salts that are listed as pet friendly? Are those better or worse? Because I could see it end up being going one way or the other.
Yeah. So, number one to know is there is no truth in labeling when it comes to de-icing salts. So you can say whatever you want on the packaging, eco-friendly, pet friendly, like it doesn't mean anything, okay, necessarily. So that's where I said I pushed the EPA because they have a safer choice label that they have on some de-icing products that are no safer chemically, but they could be used at lower rates. So if you were hypothetically, instead of, filling up your cup with salt, you only filled the cup up 2/3 and then spread that, much lower at a much lower rate, then it would be safer. But I don't think there's anybody who does that personally. So I actually pushed them, and they're ending the de-icing label program. So there will no longer be safer choice labels on de-icing products, but it's going to take a couple
Hmm.
years to phase out those labels. So back to your original question. Pet friendly sometimes means that they've taken the little granule of salt and rounded the edges so that it's a sphere and the little pet paw isn't pricked by the salt, and chemically it's no different. So that's one thing. Sometimes pet friendly salts have a little bit to a lot of magnesium chloride in them, so you're reducing the amount of sodium. So that would be better potentially for the pet paw. There could be some other non-chlorides in there as well, but sometimes it's like, 1%, 2%, 5% of something else, but usually it's still a sodium chloride based product. So again, no truth in labeling. Take a look at the back. Maybe you can see like percentages there. If something was going to be like kind of friendlier for vegetation, it might have more magnesium in it, because magnesium is a nutrient in our soil, right? Unlike sodium, which kind of breaks down soil structure, damages vegetation. But they're all magnesium, calcium, sodium, they're all chlorides. They're all in that chloride family, that they're all chlorides ending up in our water.
Hmm. That was an even more complicated answer than I expected it to be.
Yeah,
So
sorry if
I'm glad I asked the question, but you got to mention the EPA labeling thing too. So I'm so happy for that. And then kind of the last thing that I have, and if anybody else has any more questions, again, put them in the chat or raise your hand. But you talked mostly, of course, about road salt because that's the primary driver that we've seen that's done the pollution. Um, what's in your mind, when a county or a municipality has gone to a better salt solution, what has been the driver that has made that happen? Has citizen pressure been had an impact? And who is that? If so, who is that pressure best to put on? Is it your local, is it your alder person? Have those decisions largely been made within the road departments for the municipalities?
Yeah, I mean, having a couple weeks ago been in a room with the county commissioner, I'll just mention his name, Dean Stengraber from Outagamie County, and his patrol superintendent, and a couple folks from the city of Appleton. And we're there, we're talking, and Dean's like, well, kind of throws up his hands. I mean, it's the public pressure. This is what residents want. We have to do this. That said, Dean was at the table, and he did then afterwards talk about things we can do. But it's like, these are the individuals who can make the calls. Like, you've got so much power compared to the average person. But the kind of perception that most of these decision makers have is that this is what people want. People want more salt. People want to just drive at 70 miles an hour regardless of the conditions. And so I think it's important to kind of get the word out, maybe yes to alders, but also just directly to your departments of public works. I guess like the mayors, but yeah, Department of Public Works, County Highway Department, I'd say like those public works staff. So they hear directly, but then at the end of the day, they need to also have those policies kind of run by the electeds as well.
Mhm. Okay. Anybody else with questions? Otherwise, we can wrap this up. That was a great, very informative presentation, and um, thank you so much for joining us. Uh, and go to the Saltwise website, get more information. Um, I'm sure if you reach out to Allison, she'll be able to help you if you have questions about how to work on this issue locally. So with that, I will stop the recording.